Jeffrey sat in his recliner, staring at the ceiling fan as it whirred above him, a rhythmic whoosh-whoosh that had become the soundtrack to his evenings. Not that he was paying attention to it. No, he was deep in thought, contemplating something he never thought he'd have to consider. The injustice of it all. Here he was, a 39-year-old man, a dedicated husband, a responsible citizen who paid his taxes, recycled, and even held doors open for strangers, now sitting in his own home, piecing together a puzzle he never asked to solve. He wasn't Sherlock Holmes, but something was off. Cynthia, the woman he had spent the last 10 years of his life with, had been acting different. Different how? Well, he'd been asking himself the same thing for weeks. She wasn't distant in the traditional sense. No cold shoulder, no dramatic sighs or vague "I'm fine" statements. That would have been too obvious. No, Cynthia was better than that. She was clever. The kind of clever that made you question your own instincts. The kind of clever that made you wonder if you were imagining things, if you were just being one of those insecure, paranoid husbands, the kind he always swore he'd never become. But then, there were the inconsistencies. Not the kind that slapped you in the face, but the kind that whispered in your ear at night, keeping you awake. For example, Cynthia had developed an odd new habit of getting very specific about where she was going. "I'm going to Target to pick up some essentials, cotton pads, toothpaste, and that specific kind of almond milk that you hate but I swear is better for me," she'd say, grabbing her keys. Who lists out their entire shopping agenda like they're reading off a grocery receipt? And why did she start specifying the exact time she left the house? "Heading out now, it's exactly 6:17, in case you're curious." Jeffrey never asked. Not once. But suddenly, he was always given a timestamp, as if she were her own personal alibi. Then, there was the gym. Cynthia had never been a gym person. She was the type to do a half-hearted 5-minute yoga video at home, claim she felt the burn, and reward herself with a smoothie. Yet now, she was a devoted gym-goer. Not just any gym, but one that was conveniently located on the other side of town, past at least 3 perfectly fine gyms they had closer to home. Better equipment, she had explained with a shrug. Jeffrey didn't argue. He wasn't going to be the guy who questioned his wife's newfound interest in fitness. That would make him seem controlling, and he had no interest in becoming the villain of his own marriage. But the most ridiculous part? She never came home sweaty. Ever. Was she showering at the gym? Sure, maybe. But Jeffrey had gone to a gym before. There was a certain disheveled look that followed a real workout, a certain post-exercise exhaustion. Cynthia came home looking refreshed. Rejuvenated. Like she had just been to a spa, not a treadmill. And let's not forget the greatest plot twist of them all, she suddenly cared about his schedule. "So, do you think you'll be home at your usual time today?" she'd ask, all casual, stirring her coffee. Why? No reason, just curious. Curious. Right. The woman who had spent the last decade barely acknowledging his work hours now had a fascination with them. It was all too much. Too perfectly planned. Too scripted. And so, Jeffrey did something he never thought he'd do. Something that went against everything he stood for as a man who prided himself on trust and rational thinking. He ran an experiment. Nothing too dramatic, just a little tweak to his usual routine. A slight disruption to the pattern of his daily life. He left work early. He didn't announce it. Didn't send a text. Didn't even hint at it. He simply packed up his laptop at 3:30 instead of 5 o'clock, walked out of the office, and drove straight home. No warning. No chance for Cynthia to prepare. And sure enough, as he pulled into the driveway, something very interesting happened. The garage door was already open. Not wide open, just cracked. Just enough for someone to slip inside or, more likely, out. His heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of something else. A strange mix of anticipation and cold, calculated curiosity. He sat there for a second, staring at that slightly ajar garage door, before stepping out of his car, walking up the driveway, and pushing it open all the way. Nothing. Just the usual, a couple of bins, some old furniture they had meant to donate, and Cynthia's car parked neatly in its spot. And yet, something was off. The air felt wrong, like someone had been there just moments before. Jeffrey walked inside, his ears on high alert. Silence. Then, the unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. Not heavy, not rushed. Controlled. Careful. He stepped into the kitchen and poured himself a glass of water, not because he was thirsty, but because he wanted to act natural. He wanted to see what would happen next. And then, right on cue. Jeffrey? Cynthia's voice drifted down the stairs, laced with the kind of surprise she tried to mask with forced casualness. You're home early, she added as she appeared at the top of the staircase, hair slightly tousled, wearing the same clothes she had been wearing this morning. Yep. He took a slow sip of water, watching her. Boss let us out early. Cynthia nodded, as if processing this new, unexpected piece of information. Oh. That's nice. Yeah. A pause. A long, heavy pause. Where were you just now? Jeffrey asked, keeping his tone light. Cynthia blinked. What do you mean? I mean, I just walked in, and it sounded like someone was moving around up there. Her smile was quick, too quick. Oh, I was just putting laundry away. Right, Jeffrey said, nodding. Laundry. The same laundry that was already folded on the bed this morning? There it was, the slightest flicker of panic in her eyes. It lasted only a second before she recovered, but Jeffrey caught it. Must have mixed up the loads, she said with a little laugh. You know me always forgetting what I've done. Jeffrey held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then, he smiled. Yeah, he said. You always were great at multitasking. And just like that, the game had officially begun. Jeffrey wasn't stupid. He wasn't the smartest guy in the world either, but he had enough common sense to recognize when someone was feeding him a steaming pile of nonsense and calling it a gourmet meal. And right now, Cynthia was practically serving him a 5-course dinner of lies. But fine. He wasn't going to call her out. Not yet. Not because he was scared, but because this was interesting. And that was saying something because, up until recently, his life had been about as interesting as a tax seminar. So, he decided to play along. That night, he acted normal. He sat on the couch, watched TV, nodded in the right places when Cynthia talked about her day, which, conveniently, included absolutely nothing about whatever she was doing when he got home early, and even threw in a sounds tough, babe for good measure. She, in turn, acted like nothing was wrong. In fact, she acted too normal. The kind of normal that wasn't actually normal at all. The kind where she suddenly had a lot of thoughts on the state of the economy, something she had never cared about before in her entire life. Inflation is crazy, huh, she muttered while scrolling on her phone. Jeffrey turned his head slowly. What? Inflation, she repeated. It's, like, bad. You don't care about inflation. Yes, I do. No, you don't. She cleared her throat and went back to scrolling. Now, here was the thing: Jeffrey had been with Cynthia for 10 years, and he could count on one hand the number of times she had voluntarily brought up financial matters. And most of those were just her complaining about how banks were annoying. So why the sudden interest in the economy? Because she was trying to be distracting. It wasn't working. The next day, Jeffrey made another adjustment to his routine. Instead of heading straight home after work, he lingered in the office parking lot, waiting. Not because he was hesitant, but because he wanted to see. And, sure enough, at exactly 5:47 p.m., Cynthia called him. Now, normally, she didn't call him after work. Text? Sure. But a call? Unusual. He answered, keeping his voice casual. Hey. Hey, she said, dragging out the word like a guilty teenager caught sneaking in past curfew. You on your way home? Still at work, Jeffrey lied, watching his rearview mirror. Oh, still at work? Like, at the office? No, Cynthia, I'm working at my side hustle as a rodeo clown. What do you think? She let out an awkward little laugh. Just checking. You're usually on the way home by now. Yeah, well, I had to stay late, he said. What about you? Oh, nothing much, just, heading home. Heading home from where, though? She didn't say. Interesting. I'll see you soon then, he said. Yep. Soon. Click. Jeffrey leaned back in his seat, watching. Sure enough, about 2 minutes later, Cynthia's car drove right past the office parking lot. Not from home. From somewhere else. And that was when Jeffrey knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that his wife was up to something. It wasn't a matter of if anymore. It was a matter of what exactly she was doing. So, naturally, he did what any self-respecting man in his position would do. He followed her. Not immediately, of course. He wasn't a bad stalker. He gave it a solid 5-minute gap before pulling out of the parking lot and casually, very casually, making his way in the same direction. Cynthia's car wasn't hard to spot. It was the only one in the entire town with a bumper sticker that said "Live, Laugh, Love" in a font that looked like it had been designed by a kindergarten teacher. She wasn't speeding, which meant she wasn't in a hurry. That told Jeffrey two things. She wasn't rushing to meet someone. She wasn't expecting to be followed. Eventually, she turned into a small, out-of-the-way strip mall. Not a fancy one with big-name stores, but the kind of place where businesses went to quietly die. Jeffrey slowed down, keeping his distance, watching as she pulled into a spot in front of an office. A very specific office. A real estate office. Ha! Now, Jeffrey wasn't an expert in much, but he was pretty sure they weren't in the market for a new house. And Cynthia hadn't mentioned anything about needing to sell anything either. So what was she doing here? She got out of the car, glanced around, and then, in a move that was so suspicious it would have gotten her arrested in any decent detective movie, she hurried inside. Yeah. Because that wasn't sketchy at all. Jeffrey parked a few spaces away and waited. 5 minutes. 10 minutes. 15. Then, finally, the door opened, and Cynthia stepped out, followed closely by a man. A man Jeffrey recognized. Not because they were friends. Not because they had ever met before. But because this was the same man whose name had been on a certain real estate flyer that Cynthia had left sitting on their kitchen counter 2 weeks ago. At the time, she had claimed she was just looking at investment properties. Jeffrey hadn't thought much of it then. Now he was thinking a lot about it. Because this guy, this real estate agent, was standing just a little too close to his wife. And she was laughing at something he said. Jeffrey had seen that laugh before. It wasn't the polite, forced kind. It wasn't the customer service laugh she used when dealing with the bank. No. This was her actual, real laugh. The kind she used when she thought nobody was watching. The kind he hadn't heard in months. And that? That was all the proof he needed. Jeffrey wasn't a private investigator. He didn't own a trench coat, didn't have a magnifying glass, and didn't say things like "follow that car." But at this point, he was pretty sure he was better at detecting nonsense than most actual detectives. Because here he was, sitting in his car, watching his wife and some real estate agent flirt in the middle of a parking lot like they weren't about to be the reason someone committed a petty crime involving a mailbox and a strongly worded letter. Now, was Cynthia outright making out with this guy? No. Would she be able to pass a polygraph test when he asked her if she was seeing anyone? Also no. They stood there, talking, laughing, and doing that thing where people who aren't just friends lean in a little too much. The kind of body language that would make a stranger assume they were married, except Cynthia was already married. To Jeffrey. The man sitting 20 feet away, watching the whole thing like he had paid for a terrible movie and couldn't leave because he needed to see how it ended. Then, the real estate guy, who, by the way, was wearing sunglasses despite the fact that the sun had already gone down, put his hand on Cynthia's shoulder. A casual move. Friendly. Not so friendly. Somewhere in the middle. Jeffrey clenched his jaw. Not because he was going to do anything dramatic, but because he was so annoyed he could feel his own blood pressure rising. This was a lot of effort for a man who really just wanted to go home, sit on his couch, and not deal with the fact that his wife was apparently out here playing house hunters, Infidelity Edition. Cynthia finally walked to her car, and Sunglasses real estate guy gave her one last lingering look before heading back inside. Jeffrey watched as she got in, adjusted her mirror like she wasn't just emotionally cheating in broad daylight, and pulled out of the parking lot. He didn't follow her this time. He didn't need to. Instead, he got out of his car, straightened his shirt, and walked right into the office. The receptionist looked up, startled, because apparently they weren't used to customers actually coming in. The place had that weird combination of fancy and outdated leather chairs that hadn't been cleaned in a decade, a fake plant that had given up on looking realistic, and a coffee station that clearly hadn't been restocked since the Obama administration. "Can I help you?" she asked. Jeffrey gave her his best customer service smile. The one he used when dealing with customer support agents who weren't responsible for his problems but were about to hear them anyway. "Yeah," he said. "I was wondering if I could speak to." He looked at the wall, where several framed headshots of real estate agents were displayed like they were running for office. He pointed at the one with the stupid sunglasses. "Him." The receptionist blinked. "Oh. Mr. Lambert?" "Lambert. Of course, his name was Lambert." "Yeah, him." She hesitated, looking him over like she was trying to figure out whether or not this was a good idea. "Do you have an appointment?" Jeffrey smiled wider. "Nope." Another hesitation. Then, with the kind of sigh that said I don't get paid enough for this, she picked up the phone and pressed a button. "Mr. Lambert, there's someone here to see you." A pause. She nodded, then hung up. "You can go on back." Jeffrey didn't need to be told twice. He strolled down the hallway, glancing at the framed motivational posters about hustling and closing deals, and stopped when he reached Lambert's office. The door was open. Lambert was sitting behind a desk, scrolling through his phone like he was the busiest man in the world. He looked up when Jeffrey stepped in, eyebrows raising behind his ridiculous sunglasses, which he was still wearing indoors. "Can I help you?" he asked. Jeffrey smiled again. "I hope so." Lambert gestured to the chair across from him. "Take a seat." Jeffrey did. Lambert leaned forward, still acting like this was a business meeting instead of whatever it was about to become. "So, are you in the market for a new home?" Jeffrey folded his hands on the desk. "Not exactly." Lambert frowned. "Then what can I do for you?" Jeffrey tilted his head. "You had a meeting with my wife today." Lambert blinked. It was the kind of blink that people did when their brain was desperately trying to figure out if they had just walked into a trap. Lambert said, stalling. "I meet with a lot of people." "Sure," Jeffrey agreed. But this particular meeting took place outside. In the parking lot. A lot of laughing. A lot of personal space violations. Lambert didn't say anything. Jeffrey continued. "I just figured, since she never mentioned we were selling our house, I should come and ask you about it. You know, since you seem to know so much about her." Lambert scratched the back of his neck, suddenly looking very not cool. The sunglasses weren't helping. "Listen, man," Lambert said, holding up his hands like he was trying to reason with the situation. "I think maybe there's been a misunderstanding." "Oh, no misunderstanding," Jeffrey interrupted. "I understand perfectly." Lambert sighed. "Look, I don't know what your wife told you." "Nothing," Jeffrey cut in. "She told me nothing." Which is funny, because normally when you're just talking to a real estate agent, you don't have to leave out details. And yet, here we are. Lambert leaned back, rubbing his temple. "This is really awkward." "For you?" Jeffrey said, raising his eyebrows. "Imagine how I feel." Lambert let out a nervous laugh. "Listen, man, I don't want any trouble." "There's no trouble," Jeffrey said. "I'm just here to confirm what I already know." Lambert looked at him, clearly trying to gauge just how much Jeffrey actually knew. Jeffrey smiled again. You do realize she's married, right? Lambert hesitated. I mean. You mean what? Another hesitation. Then, finally, Lambert let out a long sigh and ran a hand through his hair. Man, look, it's not like that, okay? Oh, good, Jeffrey said. Because it really looks like that. Lambert sighed again. She told me things weren't great between you two. Jeffrey nodded slowly. Ah. The classic, my marriage is basically over line. I bet that's right up there with he doesn't understand me and it just happened. Lambert opened his mouth, then closed it. Then opened it again. Jeffrey stood up. Well, thanks for the chat, Lambert, he said. I think I've got what I needed. Lambert looked like he wanted to say something, but Jeffrey didn't give him the chance. He walked out, past the receptionist, past the motivational posters, past the coffee station with the expired creamer. Because now? Now it was time to see just how long Cynthia planned on keeping up this act. Jeffrey was done pretending. For the past week, he had let Cynthia carry on with her little act, coming home like nothing was happening, talking about her totally real gym sessions, asking about his schedule like she wasn't already planning her extracurricular activities around it. He had let her smile, let her ask how his day was, let her sit next to him on the couch like he wasn't supposed to notice she had been standing very close to her new real estate friend in a parking lot just days ago. But now? Now, it was time for fun. He could have confronted her. Could have sat her down, asked her how long she planned on insulting his intelligence, and waited for the usual routine of denial, fake offense, and eventual confession. But that would have been boring. Cynthia didn't deserve a straightforward confrontation. She deserved something more educational. So, Jeffrey put together a plan. Step 1, act completely normal. Which was easy, considering Cynthia had no idea he had been playing detective. He came home at the same time as always, scrolled through his phone while she went on about that one coworker who never restocks the office coffee, and even kissed her on the cheek before bed. No different from any other night. Step 2, set the trap. He picked a random Thursday because why wait for a dramatic weekend showdown when an average weekday would do just fine? At breakfast, he yawned, stretched, and casually dropped the bait. Got a last-minute work thing tomorrow, he said, taking a sip of coffee. I'll probably be home late. Cynthia, who had been scrolling through her phone, probably not texting Lambert, since she was smart enough to delete the evidence by now, barely looked up. Oh? What kind of thing? Some client dinner. Boring stuff. She nodded, took another bite of her toast, and didn't ask any follow-up questions. Which meant this was it. The window of opportunity she needed. Step 3, catch her in the act. Jeffrey didn't go to work the next day. He didn't even leave the house. He just drove his car around the block, parked 2 streets over, and walked back home. It wasn't the most creative plan, but it didn't need to be. Cynthia thought he'd be gone for hours, plenty of time for whatever she had lined up. And sure enough, at exactly 12:42 p.m., she left the house in a rush. Jeffrey watched from the living room window as she climbed into her car and pulled out of the driveway. She hadn't been dressed for the gym. No leggings, no running shoes. She wasn't dressed for work, either. Just casual enough to look effortless. Just prepared enough for a planned meeting. Step 4, follow. He already knew where she was going, but watching it unfold in real time was oddly satisfying. It didn't take long before she arrived at the same strip mall, parking right in front of Lambert's office. Jeffrey sat back, checked his watch, and waited. 30 minutes passed. Then 45. Then a full hour. Now, he could have just stormed in. Could have barged through the door, made a scene, and had a dramatic shouting match in the middle of a real estate office. But again, boring. He was after something better. So instead, he pulled out his phone and made a few quick calls. Step 5, the grand finale. When Cynthia finally left the office, Lambert trailing behind her like a puppy, she was in for a surprise. Because standing right next to Jeffrey's car, arms crossed and looking mildly amused, was her sister, Danielle. And her parents. Cynthia froze. It was almost funny, the way her brain clearly short-circuited as she tried to process what was happening. "Hi, Cynthia," Jeffrey said, all smiles. "Nice day for some real estate deals, huh?" Her mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again. "Jeffrey, what is this?" "Oh, this?" He gestured to her family. "I just thought it'd be nice for them to see what their sweet, devoted daughter has been up to during her free time." He turned to Danielle. "I mean, she did tell you she was buying property, right?" Danielle, who had always been the one person in Cynthia's life who didn't blindly defend her, just raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, no," she said. "She told me she was thinking about it. Didn't realize it involved this guy." Lambert, bless his soul, looked like he wanted to evaporate into thin air. "I should probably," he started, but Jeffrey held up a hand. No, stay. You're part of this too." Cynthia finally found her voice. "I don't know what you think is happening, but this is ridiculous." "Oh, totally ridiculous," Jeffrey agreed. "That's why I made sure to bring witnesses. You know, just in case my wild imagination was acting up." Her mother, who had remained silent up until this point, let out a heavy sigh. "Cynthia! What exactly is going on here?" Cynthia's face turned red. "Nothing. This is insane. I was just talking to—" "Oh, please," Jeffrey cut in. "Spare us the business meeting speech. We all know what this is. The only thing missing is a PowerPoint presentation on how fool you think I am." Lambert, clearly regretting his life choices, took a step back. "I should go." "Yeah," Jeffrey said. "You should." And then, just for fun, he turned to Cynthia. "And you?" Cynthia crossed her arms, her face set in an expression he knew all too well. "I'm about to spin this so it looks like I'm the victim face." "You ambushed me," she snapped. "Oh, I ambushed you. Cynthia, you've been sneaking around with sunglasses real estate guy for weeks, and I'm the problem?" He shook his head. "You know what? Forget it. I just wanted to see how long you'd keep lying if you got caught." Cynthia let out a forced laugh. "I wasn't lying." "Oh, sure, because normal married people have secret real estate appointments during work hours." Her father, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke. "I can't believe this," he muttered. "Cynthia, what is wrong with you?" Cynthia flinched, but Jeffrey? Jeffrey just smiled. Because that reaction right there was what he wanted. Not some petty argument. Not some dramatic explosion. Just witnesses. People who mattered to her seeing her for exactly who she was. He turned to Danielle. "Hey, since I doubt she'll tell me the truth, how soon do you think she'll be calling to tell you I'm the bad guy?" Danielle smirked. "Oh, it's probably already written in her drafts." Cynthia glared. "You're all being ridiculous." Jeffrey shrugged. "Maybe. But at least I'm not the one who just got publicly exposed for being a liar." And with that, he turned, got into his car, and drove off. Because he wasn't going to waste another second on a woman who didn't even have the decency to be a smart cheater. Jeffrey wasn't surprised when Cynthia showed up at the house later that evening. He had expected it. What he hadn't expected was the sheer confidence, the kind of confidence only possessed by people who believe their own nonsense. She walked in like she still had the moral high ground, tossed her purse on the counter, and sighed like he was the one exhausting her. "Wow," she said, crossing her arms. "Really mature, Jeffrey." Jeffrey, who had just taken a sip of water, blinked at her. "Oh, I'm the problem? You embarrassed me in front of my family," she snapped. Jeffrey set his glass down and nodded. "Yeah. That must have been awful for you. Being seen for what you actually are." Cynthia groaned. "This is so typical of you. Always making a big deal out of nothing." "Oh, absolutely," Jeffrey said, leaning against the counter. Nothing says nothing like sneaking around behind your husband's back with a man whose biggest accomplishment in life is selling overpriced condos. Her jaw tightened. You don't understand. No, Cynthia, you don't understand. Jeffrey gestured between them. This thing? Us? It's done. She let out a hollow laugh. Oh, come on. You're really going to throw away our marriage over a misunderstanding? Jeffrey tilted his head. A misunderstanding? He chuckled. Okay. Walk me through it. What exactly did I misunderstand? The secret meetings? The weird schedule shifts? The business discussions that somehow required unnecessary amounts of giggling? Cynthia rolled her eyes. You're blowing this out of proportion. Jeffrey nodded. You're right. I should be so grateful that my wife spent the last few months treating me like a backup plan. She scoffed. You're acting like I cheated. Jeffrey stared at her. What do you think this is? Cynthia hesitated, as if the question had never actually occurred to her before. It's not like I slept with him, she muttered. Oh, great. Let me grab a cake so we can celebrate your bare minimum of decency. Jeffrey clapped his hands together. You know what? Let's invite Lambert. I'll even get him a congratulations on almost stealing my wife card. Cynthia exhaled sharply. You're being ridiculous. No, Cynthia, Jeffrey said, voice calm now. I'm being done. She opened her mouth, probably to argue some more, but Jeffrey had already walked to the desk in the corner. He grabbed a folder and held it up. This, he said, tossing it onto the counter in front of her, is our paperwork. She frowned, reaching for it. What paperwork? The divorce, Jeffrey said, watching her face closely. Filed this afternoon. Cynthia stared at the papers like they were written in an alien language. You're serious? Very. She let out a breathy laugh. You didn't even talk to me about it? Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. Oh, I thought about having a discussion. But then I realized something, you never gave me that courtesy. Her fingers tightened around the folder. This is insane. No, Jeffrey said simply. What's insane is that you thought I was just going to sit here and accept being disrespected. Cynthia's face twisted into something bitter. And what? You think you're just going to move on? Like that? Jeffrey smirked. Watch me. For the first time that evening, Cynthia didn't have a comeback. Cynthia stood there, gripping the divorce papers like they were about to burst into flames in her hands. Jeffrey had to admit it was a nice change of pace seeing her speechless. Normally, she always had some long-winded excuse, some carefully crafted explanation designed to make her the victim of whatever situation she had created. But this time? Nothing. Just silence. Then, finally, she blinked and let out a forced laugh. Okay, so what? You're just done? Just like that? Jeffrey crossed his arms. Yes. Cynthia scoffed. You're really going to throw away everything over one mistake? Jeffrey tilted his head. One mistake? He let out a sharp laugh. That's cute. One mistake is forgetting to take out the trash. One mistake is buying the wrong brand of toothpaste. What you did was calculated. Cynthia rolled her eyes, like he was the one being dramatic. I didn't even do anything. Jeffrey let out a long sigh. You know what? Let's say, for a second, that's true. Let's say you really didn't cross that final line. Let's say I believe you. He leaned forward. Do you really think that makes this better? She hesitated. He nodded. That's what I thought. For the first time, she actually looked nervous. Okay, wait, let's talk about this. Oh, now you want to talk? Jeffrey raised an eyebrow. Now, suddenly, we're all about open communication? Where was this energy when you were out discussing real estate with Lambert? She groaned, rubbing her temples. You're impossible. See, I'd argue that I'm the reasonable one, Jeffrey said. You're the one who decided to turn our marriage into a game of how much can I get away with before my husband notices. Cynthia looked at him, frustrated, like she was waiting for him to magically change his mind. So that's it? You're just going to leave? Jeffrey shrugged. It's not like you were really here either. Her face twitched at that, but she didn't argue. Jeffrey grabbed his keys from the counter and headed for the door. I'll be back to grab my stuff later. You should probably start thinking about where you're going to live, though. Cynthia blinked. What? Oh, yeah, Jeffrey said, smirking. Since I was so unreasonable for wanting a wife who actually respected me, I already talked to a lawyer. And guess whose name isn't on the house? Her mouth opened, then closed. Then opened again. You wouldn't. Jeffrey jingled his keys. I did. Cynthia stared at him like she was genuinely trying to figure out when she lost control of the situation. He smiled. Have a great night, Cynthia. And with that, he walked out, leaving her standing there exactly where she belonged. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and rate the story in the comments.